Welcome to another series of the Summer of Open Data. My name is Stefan Verhulst. I'm the co-founder of GovLab and also lead of the Open Data Policy Lab, which is the host of the series together with our partners, the Open Data Institute, Open Data Charter, BrightHive, and Data GovHub of Georgetown. I'm delighted today to be joined by a stellar panel that will look into the third wave of open data. With regard to the third wave of open data, we typically try to explore 4 areas that we believe the next wave of open data could accelerate. The first area is to really try to understand how can we move beyond the national level and also have open data at the subnational level. The second area is really trying to understand how can we also partner with the private sector around their data and how do we develop data collaboratives. The third area that we are interested in this summer of open data relates then to how do we all do all this in a responsible way? How can we upgrade our data governance framework to allow for more data collaboration? And then lastly, given the fact that many of the initial open data projects were driven by the supply side, we also try to understand how can we learn more from the demand for open data and how can we, for instance, publish with purpose, which is obviously a concept that has been promoted lately. So those are the 4 kinds of areas that we believe are important to understand and explore during our summer of open data. And as I said, I have a stellar panel to really go into a few of those areas, but without me introducing them, which obviously would probably not do credit to all their achievements, I will ask every person on this panel to briefly introduce themselves. And let's start with Rhiannon. If you could briefly introduce yourself, indicate what you've been working on, and especially also the work that you do, how it relates with the summer of open data or the third wave of open data.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Stefan, and thanks for having me as part of the series. Hi, everybody. My name is Rhiannon Price, and I'm the director for the Sustainable Development Practice at Maxar Technologies, one of the leading satellite imagery, Earth intelligence, and space infrastructure suppliers. So my job is really dedicated to accelerating any and all of our work that relates to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So as you can imagine, it's a lot of diverse work. It's everything from food security to environment ongoing right now, global health, and how imagery and analytics can support there. In the context of open data, of course, it's a really important, what I would say, enabling environment for a lot of the customers and partners that we work with, particularly in the humanitarian and sustainability spaces. So in that sense, we work really closely with the OpenStreetMap community. So I'm repping my State of the Map shirt today, although you can't really see. So we do a lot of support with OSM, of course. Well, we work really closely with humanitarian OpenStreetMap team on humanitarian, particularly topics that come up as relates to open data. And I also helped found Maxar's Open Data program, which is I would say more of a focused on supporting disaster response and other humanitarian crises with free open satellite imagery that we release. So though engages on these topics, and I'm looking forward to sharing some of that today.
Great. Thanks so much, Rhiannon. Let's go to Stephen. Stephen, can you briefly introduce yourself? And also, I think Stephen is joining us from Tanzania today. Also indicates what are some of the experiences that you've had in Tanzania. And of course, we will go into much deeper throughout the panel, but just a brief introduction would be useful.
Thank you, Stefan, and thank you for having me as part of this series. My name is Steven Chacha. I'm the Executive Director of Tanzania Data Lab, which is a local data and innovation organization based in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, which started off as part of the MCC PEPA Data Collaborative for Local Impact Program, which was being piloted in Tanzania, and now we are sustaining it through the work of the Tanzania Data Lab as an NGO working in Tanzania. So our work is mainly focusing on stimulating and promoting the uptake and usage of data to inform policy and decision making at different levels, and also to promote data-driven innovations. And doing this very much around the third way of open data, looking on the supply side of data, on the demand side of data, on the technology and capacity around data, and also on policies and registration relating to data. So that's what has been our main focus, and we're looking forward to sharing our experience as part of this series.
Great, thanks so much, Stephen. And last but not least, Theo, who is joining us from London, where it's super warm, and as a result, I think the video has been melted. But Theo is here, of course, by a voice. And Theo, can you briefly share with us who you are and also how it relates with some of the Summer of Open Data teams?
Great. Thank you, Stefan, for the introduction. It's great to be here with everyone. My name is Theo Blackwell. I'm the Chief Digital Officer for London. So that means I advise the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, on matters to do with city data, digital transformation of city services, smart cities, and innovating with London's tech sector. So my in terms of open data, one of the units that effectively created London's open data platform, the London Data Store in 2010, which I think you would term as wave one of open data, that rests with the city, as I say, the City Intelligence Unit. And we're working closely with them on how we develop that model for the future.
Great, thanks so much, Theo. And let's start with you, Theo, because as I said, one of the key elements of the third wave is to also try to understand on how do we advance open data at the subnational level, i.e. city level, or in some cases, provincial, state level. And so tell us a little bit about the current state of play and the current thinking with regard to the use of open data as it relates to the City of London, and also whether there are any experiences in the current pandemic, of course, that you can share with regard to the value of local data. And of course, local in the City of London, of course, has different meanings than in a smaller locality. But it would be good to get a sense on any experiences that you've learned during this pandemic and how it translates into open data at the local level.
Sure. So the first thing to say is that the London Data Store, which acts pretty much as the central register of city data for London, is 10 years old, and it's been through various iterations. First of all, in 2010, it's kind of a classic open data publishing platform, digesting open data sets from the government that were useful to London cuts of the data, and some other data sources. And over time, that's grown in functionality from just being essentially a list of data sets to the ability to develop applications that are useful for policymakers and for the media and for academics and for the commercial sector. And as we developed more applications, it became clear that open data alone doesn't, cover the entire sort of universe of what we do. What we need to do is have shared data from as it were, closed data sources as well. So if you look, for example, something that's been fairly long-standing, 2015, we published Schools Atlas, which looks at pupil place projections in London. That merges quite a lot of open data, where the schools are and so on, with closed data, where the students are and where students are expected to be to assist on planning purposes. So that's the kind of application we increasingly develop, the merging of open and closed data to create something that's useful for the city. So as the data store had outgrown its scope, we've now started a project. We're quite far into a project of how we can make the data store really adapt to this need the city has of bringing those different types of data together and bringing sensor data into the fold as well. So we've worked with the Open Data Store, the Open Data Institute, and Bloomberg Associates on creating this new platform, which will quickly go out to technical specification. Now, briefly, the current crisis put the demand for real-time and near real-time data right to the fore. So this really spurred our work that was already underway because there was a need for emergency response to know if London was okay, which meant combining many, many different data sets to give decision makers that analysis. So, so I would say the result of the crisis has been a greater demand for data, particularly bringing together data that would normally be seen as closed. And it also has put into stark relief that whilst we have very capable people to produce reports on medium and long-term statistical analysis for the future of our city, what we need as an organisation is a new group of people who can digest and analyse, visualise and create products to support Londoners using real or near real-time data. So that has very much shaped and altered our thinking about how we develop the data store for the future.
Great, thanks so much, Theo. And I will come back to one of your last points with regard to skill set and also the kinds of expertise in a few moments. But let's go to Rhiannon. And so, as I mentioned, one of the components that we are interested in is not only how can governments, of course, unlock some of their data assets, but also, as you already mentioned in your introduction, what's the responsibility and practice within corporations, especially corporations that actually are in the business of data, such as satellite imagery corporations, how to go about this. And so you've been on this for a while. I think we've met a few years ago when suddenly this concept of data philanthropy at that time was fashionable. And so we'd love to hear from you, Rhiannon, some of the lessons learned and also some reflections on state of the art with regard to data collaboration, especially from a private sector point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's an important question. And I think a lot of what Theo said also really resonated in terms of not only thinking in terms of open data, but what I would say is kind of the spectrum of open data, right? Because I think too often folks think of it as a binary. It's either closed or it's open. But I think there are also, a lot of permutations in between in terms of from a data licensing standpoint, from data access, availability, things like that, that are all really important levers to consider when we're thinking about concepts like open. And I think that's especially paramount when you're thinking about engaging with private sector, because the private sector is a really diverse place. We as satellite imagery providers sit in, a specific part of that ecosystem, but even other data providers are in different positions. If you're, a telecom company, for instance, and your call detail records are also incredibly valuable, even more so these days as we have, more mobile populations. And so, whether you're an imagery provider or a telco or a government, I think they're, each organization, you have to recognize that they're in a different place on their journey when it comes to open data and their ability to support. I think for us in particular, a lot of it comes down to understanding the requirements of the community. And I think for kind of your second part of your question, Stefan, in terms of, what does it look like to better partner, and especially between public and private sector, I think it's about having these, willing collaborations, collaborations where incentives are aligned, where organizations are being transparent with each other around their objectives and around their goals in terms of working together. But I think that can be then underpinned by, the private sector truly understanding, across the table, whether it's public sector or others, or multi-stakeholders, what are your requirements with data? And that way we can be better stewards of the data, but also then you can mitigate any risk or privacy concerns and things like that, which a lot of times folks aren't necessarily thinking through when they're focused on, this is my use case, this is my emergency response, this is my need right now. So I think it's really critical to have those kind of collaborations and partnerships in place ahead of time so that folks can start to think of these issues and start to actually have workflows in place that enable more of that open ecosystem, because it's really not just about a data result. I think it's about, a transparent process, about communication, about so much more.
Great, thanks. And I want to build upon what you said, Rhiannon, as it relates to engaging communities to really understand what their needs might be and how we can, if at all, serve their needs with the data that you might have, because quite often the assumption is that you have all the data and it can provide answer to all the questions. And so, Stephen, when I think about the Tanzania Data Lab, I really think of you as the pioneer in the areas of community data collaboratives. And so I would love to hear a little bit more about how you go about establishing those data collaboratives, and more importantly, of course, how you engage communities in trying to understand what their data needs might be and how we then match that with the supply.
Yeah, thanks, Stefan. Interesting enough, actually, when the Data Collaborative for Local Impact program started 4 years ago, the subnational data cooperatives were not part of the equation there. There was just one of the projects that we're implementing at that point in time, focused actually at amplifying the voices of the citizens on the ground through data, in a way of trying to making the local government leaders more out of the issues that people are facing through data, and try to connect the local government authority leaders with their citizens, through data. So that was the main kind of focus at the beginning. But increasingly, as we continue to engage at the subnational level, we actually realize data ecosystems do exist at the subnational level, and they're actually distinct and different and separate from the national data ecosystem that we have actually been dealing with. And the two, as much as the two actually do complement each other, but they are completely different, ecosystems. That's what really led to our interest to study more and invest more in, building and strengthening subnational, data ecosystem. And in doing that, we actually realized, as much as most of this subnational data ecosystem are actually, fragmented and uncoordinated, but still they have huge potential in actually impacting the lives of the people on the ground, and really driving to really be able to support the actual data demand that exists, at the subnational level, creating it, and also to ensure that there's enough supply of data to actually be able to meet, that supply that is actually there. And engaging further at the subnational level, then we realize other issues, at that level, issues relating to data standards, issues relating to data sharing. At that level, there been a lot of duplications because people have not been talking or sharing their data at that level, but there's all issues relating to data skills. It's like you find officials within the local government authorities dealing with data, but really storing data in papers, and really lacking very basic data skills that actually needed to enable them to make sense of the data and really draw insights that could be useful to inform policies and decision making at that level. So our approach to has been through supporting and facilitating data-ledness assessments at the subnational level, and coupling that with the process of actually building a subnational data roadmap that brings together the citizens, the local government authorities, the community-based organizations operating at subnational level, the non-government organization, and the private sector entities that also operate at that level. And the whole interest at the end of the day is very much trying to, one, minimize duplication of efforts in collecting the same data that one entity or organization is already collecting, and ensuring that we enhance the data standards, so that the data from the subnational level will actually be able to to be interoperable and complement each other, at that level, and therefore, again, capitalize on the limited resources that are actually there for data collection, storage, and all that. But as well, to be able to build partnership around data in terms of data collaborative, at that level, so that different entities could actually be able to collaborate on the existing data sets, sharing data, and very much promoting their usage, to inform, policy and decision making, at different levels. And that's really has proved to be very effective and useful, I would say, in the context of Tanzania. We started with one district in Kyela, in the Southern Islands here in Tanzania. And now increasingly we are getting requests even from other donors and partners for us to collaborate and work with them in supporting civil initiatives, in other areas. At the moment, actually, we are collaborating with Botna Foundation from Switzerland to do a similar process in Tanga City Council, one of the city councils here in Tanzania. And we've actually had a number of other requests from other partners as well, trying to see how we could support them doing similar processes at subnational level, in that area. So it has really proved to be very, very, very effective. And in line with COVID, by the way, I think one of the key things that we've learned through this pandemic is the need to have ready stakeholder partnerships or collaborations, on the ground. So, things like the data roadmap, process as a mechanism at the subnational level, meaning that, usually we tend to use a lot of time to align among the different, stakeholders, build trust and all of that. So if it happens that you find a mechanism already in place, such as this kind of partnership or subnational, data collaborative at this level, it makes it much easier to be able now to agree on the next steps, or now to utilize data from different sources and use them to tackle a problem at hand, and in this case, COVID. So that has really proved to be very efficient at level, and even at the national level, when we were trying to come up with our own national COVID-19 task force, it was very much based on the similar kind of arrangements, or very much being able to bring together different stakeholders so that we could really now collaborate on data sets, work on the data standards issues, and try to see how we could actually be able to use the data that we actually have to contribute to us solving the problem.
Great. Thanks. Pretty impressive, Stephen, as always. And so I was planning on asking a question on governance issues, but before we go there, I do want to reflect a little bit on how do we sustain all of this? Because it seems like there's a lot of interesting work that needs to become more systematic. Like, for instance, your assessment of the data ecosystems seems to be crucial moving forward, and has to become more of a systematic part of the toolbox around data. And so what I would like to understand, Stephen, is what's the appetite to actually sustain all of this? And then specifically going to Rhiannon, because obviously, anyway, from a business case point of view, there might be some challenges in actually, and first of all, I think it's extremely promising that you have already a position like yours within a corporation, but at the same time, of course, how do you sustain that in the long term? And the same, Theo, for you is that typically, of course, data, especially at a time when budgets are crunched, and I think all city budgets at a time of COVID have been challenged, to say the least. How do you go about advocating for data and then sustaining that? But let's start with Stephen on how do you see, given the fact that quite often data is not seen as an asset within communities, and as a result, it becomes very hard to actually make a case for sustaining that as such.
So what we've been trying to do is actually to work with the local government authorities in the respective areas that we've been engaging, and to work with them at the highest level, at the level of the executive director of the local government authority. The executive director is the budget holder of the local government authority in the respective area. So that is very important, to talk with the right people at that level, and ensure that you achieve the ownership and the leadership that is actually needed. I think the whole concept of data stewards really comes into play here, So we are lucky enough, at least in the pilot district that we were working with, we had executive director who was truly a data steward, who really understood the role of data and appreciate the, what data, what role the data can actually be able to play to make a difference, in his district. So that was a very big plus. And with that as well, we managed to build a community, of other stewards, around him who also saw the value of it. So that was very key. And even when we actually went out to reach out and bring other stakeholders, such as the private sector, entities, non-government organizations and others, it was easy because they saw leadership was actually coming from the district council itself. And it was not a dealer-led initiative, but rather it was an initiative that was actually led with their own district council. So it was very easy for other stakeholders as well, to come in and complement, on the process. So the way we did it, we did it as a way of a strategy. So we actually developed a data strategy for the district, which had a work plan, budget, and everything. And we even convened a resource mobilization meeting involving the local businesses and companies in the area and other organizations as well, so that they could really be able to discuss and agree on how they're going to finance their strategy, the data strategy, on the district level. Cool. So I'll say the ownership at that level is key, and really ensuring that you have very strong data stewards who are really willing to own it and drive the process after the project has ended, or after the introduction phase of the project has actually ended.
Cool. Thanks, Stephen. Rhiannon.
I'd add a few things to that. I'd say in terms of the sustainability of kind of the open data initiatives from a private sector standpoint, I think there's a few things that are important. I think one, I often like to point out to folks that just when we're talking about open data, it doesn't necessarily mean free and open, right? So I think, and when I talk about that, I think it's important to think of what I like to call kind of sponsored open data, for lack of a better term. Again, where you're bringing donors, funders together who have clear goals around having open data results, particularly in collaboration with community members, et cetera, who can help foster that with the private sector, right? So I think that's also important, because that also speaks to the business case and how it becomes sustainable when, in some cases, businesses are foregoing commercial opportunities, perhaps, if they do a certain open license, if it truly is fully open for commercial use as well. So those are the types of things we've got to consider. But I also think that from our standpoint, there's a lot of different ways, curate your open data initiative or your open initiative so that it's more fit for purpose. So, like, for example, within our open data program, because we are releasing satellite imagery, we want it really focused on humanitarian response. The license there is open for non-commercial use, and then we also allow folks to use that imagery in OpenStreetMap. And that is it's a direct reaction to the feedback we hear from our community of users about how critical OSM is as a platform for humanitarian response. And so we wanted to complement both the kind of open non-commercial with that ability, even though OSM also allows for commercial use for those data too. So for us, it was a way, without kind of opening Pandora's box, so to speak, of allowing anybody and everybody to work with our imagery, which in some ways could be counter to some of our business interests, particularly on the kind of analytics side. What we do is really try to focus that program around what that community needs, around the outcomes that we're hoping to enable. And we've done that, on a number of fronts. I think our open data program is just one example. We also support, as a lot of companies do, more of these kind of ad hoc kind of data challenges. And so we have an ongoing series that we've helped kind of foster among the industry called SpaceNet. And those data and the kind of challenges that we stand up under SpaceNet with these other companies and now with government partners and others have been great because they're completely open. So depending on the kind of data set, for-profit entities can use it, public sector entities can use it. It's been really good, I think, in terms of bringing together those communities in that sense. But the focus of SpaceNet is very much around accelerating kind of bleeding edge, cutting edge applications when it comes to remote sensing. So again, I think there's opportunity for us as a community to sit down, and as I said earlier, and I think a lot of these comments have echoed it too, to really dig into requirements and start to break down what had been the barriers before. Because I think if there's, again, transparency in terms of what folks are trying to accomplish, there's a way for us to come to the table and make it sustainable and do it in a way that's not just sustainable actually, but actually improves over time, which is what I've also been able to see through our program.
Great, interesting. Theo, over to you. So as I mentioned, clearly city budgets are being challenged. And I'm not sure anyway, although I have an idea that might also be the case in London. And so how do we, and how do you keep building a case for open data and data? And also, if you're asked to prove to, for instance, what's the return on investment, are there any pointers that you've managed to establish?
It's an interesting question. I think, first off, if we just remove this from the crisis, as difficult as that might sound, pre-crisis, there was a challenge around city data platforms because it often got confused with high money pitches for smart city platforms. And there's a real industry around that. And just to reflect slightly on London's approach, London is set up where there's a strategic city hall and 32 municipal authorities, each with an average population of about 250,000 people. Each of them have their own ways of dealing with data. And so instead of saying there should be a new London-wide platform costing millions of pounds, what we said was that the London data store, as it developed, would kind of go with the grain of how our city is set up. And so we would be the central registry of metadata, if you like, the descriptor of where the data is. Mm-hmm. And then we would invest in the standards and the governance and the rules and invest in the key questions that we need to draw from that data. So instead of like this idea of this being this massive pool of data that we have to, forever increase the number of data sets we have to show that we've got lots of data, just focus on the kind of key questions we want to answer and the key people we need to talk to. Mm-hmm. So that sort of technology platform actually is at the much lower end of the cost scale, but adds value to the 32 authorities that would otherwise be investing in data. So think of it like a library index card in an old university library. You go along and you find out from the index where the book is. You go and order it. Essentially, it enables peer-to-peer data sharing in a much less frictionless way than exists for normal. And that, although we haven't put a number on it, it reduces the amount of resource that you need to use data, whether it's talking to lawyers or information governance experts, and it increases its value over time with the domain experts who want to do something with that data, be it climate change or otherwise. And secondly, and this does relate to the crisis, the key thing that we were able to see during the crisis, with so many people presenting themselves with needs that we'd anticipated or not anticipated, is it gives us a huge insight into vulnerability. Now, this is a really important question for municipal authorities that deal with social care or children's services, because usually the real budgetary pressures for a municipal authority come from a relatively small percentage of people who are very high users of services. So the crisis enabled us to have another conversation with vulnerable people about their needs. And that data is actually really valuable in social policy terms because it enables us to think more about prevention. And ultimately that has a business case in itself. So because you will be making interventions to prevent people with who are suffering with bad conditions worse, or preventing them in the first place. None of this, I think, stacks up in a traditional business case, but in terms of where people would like to see innovation go, they're much more likely to take a look in this direction. So I think those two things are important. I think the focus isn't so much on the big all singing, all dancing platform. It's how you connect data and resource it with human beings. And secondly, focus on vulnerable human beings are the things that have shone through.
Great, that's interesting, Theo. And I want to come back to one of the aspects you raised at the beginning, which was around skill sets. And it's great to have data, but if there's no skill set to either leverage or even think about the value of data for his or her kind of mission, it might be, the value might be limited. And at GovLab, we've been advocating for this concept of, as Stephen and Rhiannon already referred to, of data stewards, which are individuals that have the skill set to really understand what are the questions that matter for a particular kind of communities, and then how can we connect that with data. And Theo, you mentioned also, is that a critical part of what you've been doing is to not only build the data store, but also understand the kind of questions that communities in London care about. And so, question to you, Theo, is that, is there a need for more investment in data steward skills so that you would actually have across all boroughs, you would have a data steward, and if so, what are those skills that you feel are lacking, in addition to, of course, the traditional skills of actually crunching data or visualizing the data that has been, the insights that have been generated?
So the way I'd address this question is, I mean, yes, there's always a case for more investment in more people who've got data expertise, especially as I said at the beginning, on real-time data. But ultimately, more data people will only work more effectively for the city if they are in a room with the domain experts doing the discovery phases around what user need is. And so what we've done is we've taken a leaf out of the government digital service standards that were set up about 5 or 6 years ago and since been modified. And we thought, well, we need to create a process for the creation of data questions and a service to sit behind it. That involves all of the normal steps you'd expect in an agile process, in order to really find out what the crucial questions that drive the solutions to the problem are. And so I would say that, for that, you need the domain experts, and you also need, the equivalent of data stewards, but you also need the people from the design community who've developed digital services in the same room, almost as the people to keep the tempo and drumbeat going, and to help people think about how the questions are iterated and changed and how hypotheses are challenged. Because the framing of a data question is quite an art, and sometimes even with very big challenges, the tiniest slivers of questions can make the biggest difference. And you only get to that by drawing out the expertise of the people in the room. I think that, so I would say that investment in process, the service development process that we see from the digital world is highly applicable here.
Great, thanks, Theo. And Yeah, no, I think we are totally aligned. As you might know, we have an initiative at GovLab which is called the 100 Questions, which exactly tries to develop this new science of formulating data questions by actually engaging with what we call bilinguals, which are people that are both domain experts but also have a data expertise, because you do need to bring domain expertise to the table. Stephen, let me go to you because I saw you were shaking your head when you were listening to Theo. Does any of that resonate? And I'm sensitive to the time here as well. So let me also immediately pose the last question to you, Stephen, is that if you would have a magic wand and it says like, I can use this magic wand to at least establish one thing that would advance this third wave of open data, what would be your focus area? What would you use your magic wand for?
I very much agree on the issue that Theo was referring to on the role of the domain experts. Is something that we are also, facing with a number of government agencies that we are actually, working with, and even the National Bureau of Statistics. It's like there's, it doesn't matter how good a data scientist is, the role of, domain expert is usually crucial in order to be able to draw the right insights and asking the, to ask the right questions, on the data that, that we actually, have. Coming to the question that you posed to me, so one of the things that we've been struggling with, and I'm not so sure if it's the case, in other countries as well. For example, during the COVID, outbreak, the pandemic that we're dealing with at the moment, we had been approached by some of our partners, including the telecom, operators, willing to share the data, so as to be able to enable us, to draw insights and be able to inform interventions, on COVID. And as well, the other partners that were willing to, join hands, including, social media giants who were willing to, offer their data, for that. But one of the things that really made it kind of difficult, I would say, to us, is one, lack of data protection, registration in the country. So the telecom operators are willing to share their data, but they're not sure what data sets are okay to share, which ones are not okay to share. And if they end up sharing the ones that are not okay to share, as much as we don't have a Data Protection Act, what will happen to them? Very much try to manage their risk as well for that point of view. And also having big players like, the social media companies also willing to share their data. But again, for them really to be able to understand what kind of data sets could actually be able to be relevant in our context, and for them to be able to know if it's okay to share that kind of data with us. So there's this whole issue of registration that I'm trying to allude to, which I also consider to be very important in ensuring that we do harness this data and use it to inform policy decision making, but also in an ethical way. So there's a need to promote, especially in a country like Tanzania, where we do not have Data Protection Act, and a number of other countries in the region as well. So there's the need to have that in order to be able to facilitate the uptake and usage of this data. But again, we also need to approach that very carefully, but because there's also an issue of over-registrating, because if we don't do it, carefully, then we might end up having very, bad registrations in place that may not even make any of this, possible. So how to create the balance between the two, and how to leverage experiences of other countries like the UK, maybe, and others who are already in advanced stages of this, so that we will really be able to benefit from the experiences and replicate that by localizing it to our local context.
Great, very valuable. Thanks, Stephen. Rhiannon, so you're like the archetypical kind of data steward that we always point to within corporations. So as a data steward, if you at least agree with that kind of label, so what would be, from your point of view, an aspect that could be transformative if we get this right?
Yeah, I think for data stewards, I think a couple things. I think one, having, whether it's the profile of people or the teams behind those people, I think it's really mission critical that they have experience working in both public and private sector. Because there is, and I've experienced this having been on both sides of that fence, that there's such a divide still. And I think a lot of it is just culture clash and can be broken down. And I think having people with a more diverse background, more diverse experiences coming to the table will help us get there quicker. So absolutely, I think from that standpoint, having those types of folks within an organization helps immensely. I will say though, the one thing I'd caution is, it's one thing to have kind of a data steward set up within an organization, and it's another to enable that person or those teams to do that work. And I think so it's important that there's also a culture and an appreciation of the value of open data and what they're doing. Otherwise, it's like, companies that'll stand up a chief diversity officer just to do it, thinking that's going to solve the problem. And that's not the case. It's a myriad of things that it's going to take to get an organization to truly be, I think, a little bit more proactive around these types of things and really start to break down those silos so that whether it's companies or other organizations can enjoy the benefits of working with, multi-stakeholders, different types of actors than they've worked with before, because there's definitely value there. And I think data stewards are a good way to get us there, but not necessarily a panacea. They absolutely need to be supported.
Great, thanks. Theo, you have the last word. So if you would be able to solve one problem that could be transformative, what would be the problem you would be prioritizing?
I think it would be the problem that we have chosen to focus on, which is improving data collaboration in a multi-data holder city. Now, as I said before, London is shaped in a certain way with its boroughs and its big public agencies, but and that's it's a large European city with 9 million people. But every city, whether it's New York or Helsinki or elsewhere in the world, will have many data holders. Not one city or one organization holds all of the data that it needs to solve the problem. And that's evident when you get the data people and the domain experts and other stakeholders in the room. So data collaboration is fundamental. So what we are trying to do is create a platform and a culture of data sharing and driving that forward by a number of really important use cases that everybody, including private sector data holders, can agree on, such as electric vehicle charging, other climate change issues, air quality and air pollution, and finding that subject that many players can together agree on as a common purpose and spinning up use cases from there. That's what we were doing before the crisis. And of course, the crisis has broadened the range of things that people want to do together. So, in conclusion, creating the right framework for data collaboration by removing the friction points, cultural, technological, leadership, expertise that stand in the way of proper purpose-led data sharing.
Great, thanks so much. Thanks, Theo. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Rihanna, for joining us. And I hope you all enjoyed yet another series of the Summer of Open Data. Thanks to all.